This one's going to be a little bit different. Jerome is not going to do a full-length seminar, but instead he has an article on TVOL, which hopefully you know about, and hopefully a fair number of you have read the article, as I have. And so we're going to have a brief introduction from Jerome, and then we're going to have a broad-ranging conversation. And for that reason, I think that when we do speak, then if you could take some time and introduce yourself as an individual and the kind of cooperative societies that you work with, or your particular interest in joining this group, we'll spend a little bit more time, I think, or I would say give a little bit more time to the other members of this group, as opposed to a very short Q&A. And hopefully we have 90 minutes, so it's very spacious, and we'll really be able to get into the particular interests of some of the people who have come here to talk about cooperative social organizations, and we'll begin to be able to introduce ourselves to each other. And I think that we're still having some people come in. Oh, Elizabeth Castillo. Haven't seen you for a while, Elizabeth. That's great. So we'll get going in just a minute. There's Graham Boyd, with whom I had a sparkling conversation with only yesterday. I have a great life. Nobody should feel sorry for me. These are such great people to hang out with. And as much as we complain about having to do things online, what you can do online is absolutely amazing to be combined with in-person meetings. That's what we should strive for. All right, let's get started. So I'm really pleased to introduce Jerome Warren, who I've met maybe about a year ago, and I think, and then you wrote this article for TVOL on the tradition of cooperatives in Italy, which is great, to reflect upon the long history of cooperatives. Nothing new about them. And so, but in addition to this historical perspective, Jerome, as you'll see, is also very much in the present day and is editing a handbook on cooperative societies for Routledge that Warren, Jerome, that I hope you tell us about. So why don't you begin introducing yourself, and then we'll proceed to have a conversation centered on the article that you wrote, but also going wherever we wanted to.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and speaking in apparently such a diverse group. I don't know many of you. Some of you I do know, and I recognize even some very good friends. So it's a pleasure to be here. And maybe just to back up one step, I've been aware of, David, your research for many, many years, even as an undergraduate at the University of Alabama, and via actually Edward O. Wilson, who was actually somebody who was a patron of the high school that I attended in Mobile, Alabama, where he was from the Alabama School of Math and Science. And they just are opening the Wilson, I think it's called the Wilson Science Building, actually. Which is, I think, part of an endowment that he left the school. And so that got me very early on interested in, who knows, the idea, I would say, from politically speaking, very much an anarchist-minded guy. The joke that Woody Allen told that he would never be in a club that would accept him as a member, to me, is not a joke, but there are basically misfits, or people who are very individualistic in their outlook, and you try to forge your own path, and that very much describes my own development, I think. And so the idea of multi-level selection I found very compelling and interesting, and that's actually what got me sort of connected with your research, David. So then, fast forwarding a few years, I was interested in economics because after the financial crisis, many economists were invited on CNN and other TV programs to talk about what's going on. People like Larry Summers, who I didn't find very convincing, to be honest. And so I got involved in, as an undergraduate, basically starting from scratch with a neoclassical economics background, which I did not find satisfactory. And even through my bachelor's thesis, I came back to these kinds of topics of social preferences, the society, the idea that people are not methodological or ontological individuals, but we are embedded in some kind of culture. And so, anyway, that informed my fundamental perspective, as an undergraduate and going into grad school and so on. And that brings me up to the research that I started with Italian cooperatives. I have been interested again in cooperatives for some years. The first bank that I was involved in as a student was a cooperative, was a credit union. So these things had been sort of in the background in my mind for many years. And I took the opportunity of my master's thesis to actually go down to Italy, wonderful country, that people visit all the time for tourism, which I did some of as well. But the main focus of my trip to Italy was to become acquainted with the cooperative movement there. And mainly I was in touch with Lega Coop, which is, I would say, the largest federation of cooperatives in the world, as far as I know. In total, Lega Coop, a couple of years ago, I guess the statistics would be they had about 25 billion euros in revenue a year as a federation. So it's quite an impressive collection of enterprises in all sectors of the Italian economy, from furniture making to grocery stores to housing to anything you could imagine. Very intense and high tech machine goods manufacturer, and so on. So any sector that you can imagine, tourism, there are co-ops in Italy that are involved, and it makes up more than 10% of the GDP of Italy. And of course, we can talk about GDP as a measure. Some here are very critical of it. I don't know if Sally Gomer is here, and Dan Fiskus and Brian Fatt, Bob Ulanovitz as well, are people very critical of seeing GDP as the solitary measure of value. David, I know yourself as well in this category. And so basically, I came into this research very naive and just encountered the individuals who kind of took me in and said, how can we help you? What do you want to know? And very quickly got acquainted with the diversity of enterprises that you do find in Italy, and that you have found. And in fact, what I found most fascinating to begin with, and I didn't even know how to ask the questions, was this phenomenon of social cooperatives. And this is the topic of the article that I wrote that was published in March in TVOL. And the history of these cooperatives is a fascinating thing, because of course you have on the one hand the tradition of cooperatives in Italy, which has a number of different, I would say, cultures. Again, the Catholic social movement that you had, in the US, you had Dorothy Day and so on. And you had this tradition, as well as the socialist and communist party and their agenda, so to speak, which is a very different one than the, say, Stalinist parties in other parts of Europe. So, and then you had sort of liberal democratic confederations of enterprises. Can you still see me? Okay. So, so all of these different elements of the Italian cooperative movement, there are two of me here because I was having some problems before, so I'm logged in with my phone. I didn't clone myself, so anyway, but so all of these different elements of the Italian cooperative movement, I should say, were very influential in the anti-fascist resistance against Mussolini, who was, of course, an opponent of the cooperative movement as an autonomous vehicle for self-management, so to speak. So after the Second World War, in fact, the Italian cooperatives became enshrined in the Italian Constitution. And if you read the 45th article of the Italian Constitution, it protects the specific social nature of cooperatives. And this, to me, was reinforced time and time again in my meetings with the cooperatives. I said, the Italian state recognizes the specific role that we play in producing not only economic, but also social value. And that's something that no government, whether you have now Giorgia Meloni or others, can take away, because they can't just amend the Constitution. And so that's, I think, a very important element. And so there's a great book by Foote, just out a few years ago by Verso Press, called The Man Who Closed the Asylums. And it's about Franco Basaglia, a psychiatrist that many of you are probably aware of, part of what's called the critical psychiatry or anti-psychiatry movement. And he grew up in Venice, was part of the anti-fascist movement, and then got his first main occupation in a mental asylum at the literal border of Yugoslavia, between Italy and Yugoslavia in the immediate north of Italy. So the boundary between Italy and Yugoslavia literally ran through the asylum, and Gorizia it was called. And he came into this place and found it very dilapidated, and the patients barely surviving, as he said. And basically, his first day, the head nurse came up to him and advised him to sign off on the various medications and procedures and punishments that they had come up with through the night. And he said no. And so this no started basically a movement that culminated, you could say, in the creation of the Italian social cooperatives that have flourished until today. And why? Because the asylum system was still a relic of the 19th century. And as Italy was, as many other countries were transforming after the war, with the integration of women into the workforce and many other new dynamics and aspects, there was a perceived need to change the system. And Basaglia and his colleagues like Slavic and others drew on the tradition of cooperatives as an alternative. Perhaps it's possible to get rid of, to replace these very hierarchical institutions that we have created to deal with the pazzi, the crazy, as they were called, over the centuries, with something that's based in the community and based on reciprocal relationships and you could say democracy. And even this idea of bracketing the doctor-patient relationship, saying, you know, I'm a psychiatrist, you're the patient, but we're both human beings, let's just talk. So this was the general attitude that Basaglia took, and there's a great discussion in this book by Foote, and I mentioned it in this article, as to how the political transformation occurred. It didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of pushing and pulling, using things like a referendum as a threat, which made the Italian parliament act very, very quickly in order to create some legislation. So oftentimes you look at the US Congress and they didn't have a speaker and they're not doing much. And I think 90-something% of Americans don't really approve it. As you see, when there is sufficient pressure and it's coming from the right direction and people are well organized, you can achieve a lot even with a very reticent and or corrupt political system. So I think in 1978, this Basaglia law, I think it was passed, Legge Basaglia, that culminated in the closure of the asylums. They didn't close immediately because they needed to find a model to replace them with. And that took almost about 20 years. No, not quite 20 years. 1991, the law 381 of that year was passed that saw the creation of these social cooperatives that finally then actually saw the closure of the asylums and the creation of the first social cooperatives throughout the country. And these were divided into two types, and I talk about them in the article. We can talk about that if you would like. Maybe I won't bore you with the details. If you have questions, or maybe some people here are actually quite familiar, or perhaps we have practitioners, I'm not sure, that can talk about their experiences. So you have basically cooperatives that are providing services to people in need. You have either mental health patients, you have migrants who need some kind of inclusion policy, language classes, or youths who might need some kind of coaching or mentoring. And then that's one type. And the other type is actually providing any kind of service or good, producing any kind of service or good, but hiring people with special needs. So those are the two types. Now I've said it. And the interesting thing, and this is what I talk about in the article, is that immediately as you saw the first of these social cooperatives, you saw again mutations appearing within the domain of social cooperatives. And so you saw, for instance, in Valle dei Cavalieri, which is a small mountain village, you could say, in the heartlands of Emilia-Romagna, which is basically the heartland of Italy's cooperative movement. You saw members of this community, you could see the gears in their brain working. And they thought, well, we can use this legal form to actually prop up the local community by creating a kind of synthetic enterprise, like a bed and breakfast, a restaurant, etc., some kind of a tour guide kind of enterprise where all of us can work together. And this can help stem the tide of young people leaving the community and drainage of skills and know-how and population. And so this was the first, I call crossover community cooperative that you actually saw in Italy, which existed before there was any legal framework. And these kinds of mutations maybe appeared in a sporadic way based on certain needs on occasion. And ultimately, there was who was the Italian Minister of Labor, Poletti, Giuliano Poletti. He was the head of Lega Coop, the largest cooperative federation. After this, he was the Minister of Labor in, I think it was, what's his name's government? I forget his name now. Anyway, so many governments in Italy. Matteo Renzi. And he became aware of the Valle di Cavalieri and similar experiments and thought, you know what? The Italian cooperative movement, which has been so focused on its own members, on producing value, workers' cooperative, productive cooperatives, construction, these kind of things, needs to get closer to the communities that have produced the value, so to speak, that are behind the value production. And we need to put more value back into regenerating these communities. So this idea of regeneration was very much on the top of Poletti's mind. This was then connected to an effort by the then mayor of Melpignano, a very small community in the extreme southeast of Italy, in the heel of the boot. Ivan is his name. I just saw him again for a few days ago. He was the mayor of Melpignano 2010 to 2020. And at this time, there was an effort by a large company to construct a solar farm, as you say, a very large grid near this community, which is incredibly beautiful. It's out of the way. They have mines for, I think it's marble, and all of the marble in the area, for instance, Lecce, comes from Melpignano, and Melpignano itself is full of these tan or yellow stone streets and buildings. It's a beautiful village that actually everyone should see. And they thought, in fact, why would we allow this to happen in our village and destroy the ambience and destroy the environment? We have flat roofs. Let's organize a service cooperative that basically puts the solar panels on our roofs. We can use the electricity, any excess can be sold on the market. And so this was a concept that met, so Poletti and Ivan met together and basically crafted a plan to create a new type of cooperative, which turned out to be the very first of its kind. And in 2014, they did pass the law. So they created a service cooperative in 2011 that then mutated in 2014 into a new legal form, which is the Cooperativa di Comunità, which was a regional law by Puglia that basically moves beyond providing services to people who are excluded, for instance, migrants or mentally challenged, handicapped people, youths, and so on, and is directed at the community. It's not directed at any particular stakeholder group. It's directed at people in the city, in the town, and it's open to everyone to join. And the value that is produced from these cooperatives is spread not only across the membership, but across the entire society, however it is constrained. The city, there are some of these that have been popping up. I think there are over 300 of them now that have appeared in less than 10 years. They have spread from rural communities to big cities like Genova. I visited one community cooperative there in the north, which is called Cesto, which is short for Centro Storico, the historical center, which is basically a cooperative that has tried to reclaim part of the old historic center of Genova that goes back to the Roman era. There are, in fact, ruins underneath the street there that you can visit, and which was an area that had been sacrificed to drug dealers and various other criminal elements. And the cooperative is basically tasked with managing this historical center. They've put in art markets and events. While we were there, there was a huge event that was, Italians are always celebrating something. There was a marching band. There were many stands selling beer and food and so on. So they're bringing people back into the city. They're bringing value back into communities. And the fascinating thing again is that you have this trajectory from basically rejecting a hierarchical distinction of roles, whether it be between employer and employee, between doctor and patient, or whatever, or bureaucrat and citizen. So this idea of clientelism, and the cooperatives, I think in Italy, there are other examples we can talk about in Argentina, in Spain, etc., have done a wonderful job at creating a very cohesive and reproducing, so to speak, a resilient ecosystem of inclusive growth, or I wouldn't even call it growth necessarily, but regeneration, really, I would say. And so maybe I might share, and basically that's all I have to say. I have maybe one graphic that I could show you from a talk that I gave on this topic, which might just be a little bit redundant. I mean, you're not all stupid, but I mean, sometimes there are people who think more visually. And so I've shown this. There's one mistake here. I didn't mean to write 4.5 billion, should be million rather, but it doesn't matter. It's just an average price anyway. So I compare in this graphic, which again, I've shown at some conferences in the past, two counterfactual scenarios. This is the Melpignano case. On the left, you find what was supposed to have happened, where you have a big national bank giving a big company a big loan so they can build a big solar farm outside of this community and sell the citizens electricity, and the citizens pay money. And of course, there are taxes that go to the regional government, and that's it. So you have the electricity, the revenues, the taxes, the interest on the loan, and the loan itself. And on the right, you actually have what happened in Melpignano, where you have what I call a gifted minority who really organize themselves to create and to really fulfill a vision and to execute this vision. And who then got together with Lega Co-op and the regional government to craft this law. And really, the cooperative didn't just stop with electricity. They created new services, which I have here, number 9. So they purified water in the local groundwater that had been somehow dirtied by runoff from agriculture. And so they built these Casa del Agua water houses where you can take your refillable bottle and you have a subscription, monthly subscription. It's very cheap. I think it's 5 cents, a bottle that you fill up with sparkling water, that they even have ozone there to clean the lid of the bottle. And so they have after school programs. They have refurbished a park in the local community where even people from neighboring villages will come sit in the park in the evening and enjoy, a pizza that you can order at the cafe there, or a cup of espresso or whatever. And so the point is that you have many more flows that are being generated by this kind of inclusive system than just the sort of consumer or clientelist one. You have the influence, you have the new law, you have the new services, you have increasing members. About 300 people in this village of 2,500 are members now, and it's increasing. You have the mutual aid, and then you have all the rest of it. You have the electricity and the revenues and the taxes and the loan and so on, which was, I think, 35,000. And so they've produced so much value in the last, I guess, 9 years. I even have statistics, if you would like to know, of how many liters of water, how many kilowatts of electricity, and how many members they've served, and so on. So I think they've done a wonderful job. This is just one of, again, over 300 of these community cooperatives in Italy. And then again, there's the tradition of social cooperatives. There are at least 15,000 of these in Italy, but probably many, many more. I would say probably more than 20,000. And so they're offering many, many services, doing very much that the state is not offering, the market is not delivering. And so, in fact, you have people just organizing themselves and providing their needs and developing a sense of community on the way. And I think that's where I would just stop and open for discussion.
Hey, that's amazing. No, amazing that Mondragon came up as the most famous example of a cooperative. And this is still larger, you say. So I think to kick off the conversation, I'd ask you to say a little bit about Mondragon in relation to this, and then open it up. And so for anyone who wants to speak, please raise your virtual hand. That will form a queue. And I'm so eager to have other people join this conversation. So, but if you could say just a little bit, and also, Jerome, just a little bit about your current project with this Handbook of Cooperative Societies might be useful as we head into the discussion part of this session. You might be muted, Jerome.
Sorry, I guess I didn't click. I said, sorry, I will start with the handbook because it's more of a coherent and closed phenomenon. So this handbook, it's the Routledge Handbook of Cooperative Economics and Management. And we started calling it the cooperative economics, but we wanted to get actually management scholars involved. So the point is actually to gather the state of the art, and even beyond the state of the art, we're trying to create even an open paradigm, if one doesn't yet exist, of scholars working on topics of economics and management focus from a logic of cooperation instead of perhaps bargaining in the market, prices, or authority, the firms are, are these sort of authoritarian institutions, according to people like Ronald Coase, who basically says, well, a worker doesn't just go somewhere or do something because there's a price, but because the manager says, go here. So in fact, there are a number of very interesting practitioners and scholars. I mean, if you, basically starting from the practitioners, I would say there are a number of thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions of firms in the world, and these could even be family companies, small and medium enterprises. Not all are cooperative, bicycle repair shops or bakeries or something, where there isn't this level of bargaining, where there really is a sense of community, where people are achieving some kind of common purpose and they have shared values. So really, we're trying to look and gather all the research, the best research that we can find on, again, management. How does one govern an organization? What is the entrepreneurial vision? How can one have maybe collective or cooperative visions of entrepreneurialism? Even looking at things like finance, sustainability, technological innovation. How can you direct or govern technology in a way that is decentralized, that is democratic, and that doesn't increase the dangers of conflict, war, surveillance, and all these sorts of problems that we've encountered in recent years in elections and so on. By the way, elections is a topic that we're also discussing. Will be an interesting chapter by Simon Peck about introducing sortition or lotteries into governance, the governance of enterprises. I mean, going back to the Greeks, the Athenian version of democracy, we could have a very long discussion about what is actually democracy. We consider ourselves Western democracies, and we have parliamentary systems. And in many ways, these are a large deviation away from what, for instance, even Aristotle called a democracy. For Aristotle, democracies did not use voting because voting elected flatterers, those people who promised the people everything. So there are many, many topics from theory to foundational issues, methodology. How does one even evaluate the research? There's a chapter by Bob Bodanowitz and myself about applying a process ecology view of looking at indirect effects that actually, beyond competition, are showing a mutualistic relation. I mean, just as an example, Bob did some research in the 80s on a swamp ecosystem in Florida on the relation between, say, alligators, snakes, and turtles, which you imagine, okay, the alligator is predating upon snakes and turtles. But in fact, they found that indirectly, the predation of alligators on turtles, for instance, actually increases the turtle population by removing turtle specimen from other predators. So there is a kind of this mutualistic basis in ecosystems and living systems, and we believe in the economy as well, that underlie any kind of market competition. So that's something that we're working on together, looking at, for instance, the US economy divided into compartments. How are they relating with another? So that's still an ongoing project. And Bob and myself both had COVID in recent weeks, so we're sort of also pushed back a little bit on our back foot. And so there's lots of that going on in the book. It will be coming out, or will be sent to the publisher, hopefully, knock on wood, in March. By the way, after that, we're going to create a research companion, which will be more of a, I would say, political book. So talking about cooperative movements and so on in the global context. What does it look like in Argentina? What does it look like in Italy versus in Spain? This could be a way to seg now to Mondragon. I think the main difference between the Italian cooperative federations and Mondragon is the level of centralism. I would say there is an increased level of centralism in Mondragon, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different history. It's a different system that grew up around the first cooperative Ulgur that later became Fagor, which actually went bankrupt in 2013. Interesting story there, by the way, as well. They did manage to relocate 92% of the workers or give them some kind of early retirement. So they didn't just lay off everyone. But this sort of history around Uyghur and around the Calle Laboral Popular, the CLP, led to a very particular culture that is quite distinct from for instance, the Cooperative Federation Lega Coop, which is much more decentralized. They do have an investment fund. It's called a Co-op Fund, and they just this year celebrated 30 years. It's a €500 million fund, so it's not a small peanuts anything. So they're funded actually by every affiliated cooperative giving up every year 3% of their profits. So 3% of every co-op's profits, whether it be co-op, the largest supermarket chain in Italy, very profitable enterprise, or the smallest bakery, gives up 3% of their profits. They go to the investment fund, which then redistributes it as needed in investment projects, factoring services, liquidity shortfalls, new business plans, funding things like the project in Melpignano, these kind of kooky social experiments and so on. So really, they've got this pump that's relocating value to where the community sees it as being necessary. And again, that's also something that Mondragon has. And Mondragon is, again, just, I would say, a little bit more centralized. And there has been some conflict in Mondragon with a few cooperatives leaving the group in recent years. So it's a fascinating example. It's a very successful example. I have many good friends and contacts there. And they existed in the shadow or in the lee, in the wayside for many years, even through the fascist dictatorship, being in a quite isolated region of Spain, in the north of Spain, and in the Basque region, Bilbao and San Sebastian and so on. So they were quite, I would say, ignored for many years, and they did their thing. And they do have a very strong cooperative tradition there as well. Which again, I mentioned just in passing at the very end of the TVOL article, that there were cooking cooperatives actually during the fascist dictatorship, because Franco forbade, again, like Mussolini, these kinds of self-organizing societies. They were forbidden to speak their own language. So what they were allowed to create were these cooking clubs. And so the cooking clubs, this is why you have such great restaurants, by the way, in the Basque region. Some of the top restaurants in the world are there. They basically used cooking as an undercover activity for many other things, for political discussions, for organizing, and basically speaking their own language, and creating a resistance movement. And so that's boiled into their DNA, so to speak. And so it's another very particular model. And we've talked, David, you and I, about the ability to reproduce that elsewhere. I think it's best reproduced, the Mondragon model, where there are also challenges, maybe racism, some kind of fascist threat, where people have no other alternative, and they have to cooperate out of a need to they don't have access to capital, they don't have access to credit, so they turn to themselves and basically self-organize.
Yeah, well, so let's have some folks enter in this conversation. Please raise your virtual hands. Here we go. Bob Ulanowitz.
Okay. I noticed in your diagram.
And Bob, please introduce yourself very briefly.
I'm sorry. My name is Bob Ulanowitz. I'm a chemical engineer by training, but I've spent my entire career in theoretical ecology, and especially with networks of who eats whom and how much in the system. And you can learn an awful lot about a system just from the diagrams without the accompanying mathematics. But it did some of that too. But anyway, what I wanted to, I noticed in your one graphic that you put out, the importance of banks, a national bank sort of directing things, and then a local bank that can, and it reminded me of the situation of spontaneous community generation that happened in Brazil, in Curitiba, Brazil. And what happened there was there's a large favela, it's sort of a poor area of the state, and with very narrow streets that were clogged with trash. You couldn't get around to them. The fire department couldn't get into them, et cetera, et cetera. It was a major civic problem. Well, the mayor had a good idea. It says, let's give out bus tickets to anyone who brings so many kilograms of trash down to a certain place. And it worked. It worked very well, and it cleaned up the streets. But something unexpected happened as well. He gave out bus tickets, and people generally didn't use the bus tickets to go riding around the tent. They used them as a currency, an alternative currency. And it created essentially a community And they prospered very well under this. And since then, I think some real big banks have moved in and try to build on top of it and whatnot. But I think it was a wonderful example of how community creation can come about through essentially independent currency. Well, it's just something I wanted to add to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Jerome, would you like to comment on that?
I think the issue that Bob is that's behind the comment that Bob is saying is the importance of circulation. What good does value do if Elon Musk, I mean, I'm just using him as a kind of a whipping boy, but anybody just is hoarding it. And the idea that it in mainstream economics comes about as savings is equal to investment, it's clearly not the case. And I think if you even study Keynes, who isn't the most radical Marxist that you can imagine out there, he was managing Cambridge University's endowment. Keynes actually distinguishes between speculation and investment. So I think much of what you see today is equal to hoarding. Why is the richest person in the world the head of Louis Vuitton? We're creating an economy that's pumping money up to the wealthiest who are hoarding it in perhaps tax havens. I'm a little bit exaggerating, of course, but the point that Bob is getting at is we need to circulate resources in order to have a sustainable social system, and the economy is a social system.
Yeah. So Cheryl, please introduce yourself.
Yes, Cheryl Romanek. I'm retired from a career in systems. My educational background is systems technology. My educational background is systems theory from the sociological perspective, and I have continued interest and readings in physics and in economics. Two things. One, I am the work that you're doing, Jerome. Where does Elinor Ostrom's 8 design principles fit into what you're doing? It sounds like it's very integrated. And the other thing is that our capitalistic economic system, which is really more oligopolistic, but is based on scarcity, the idea of scarcity. And the problem with that is we have a mindset of scarcity. Guess what? We turn around and create that very scarcity that we're trying to avoid.
Elinor Ostrom, I think is a wonderful scholar. Was a wonderful scholar. I remember the first time I encountered her work was in an undergraduate economics course on I think it was industrial policy, and the professor, Professor Schlösser, a very typically German guy, he didn't cover her, but he mentioned her. I guess this is the constraint that the mainstream economics curriculum places upon you. You're required to do, the utility functions and these, the jumping jacks. And so he mentioned in a footnote, Elinor Ostrom. And I think I asked a question about him. He said, yes, she's a fascinating scholar. You should read her. Okay, so put that on the back burner, I think, until the next Christmas break or whenever I had some time to read test relevant literature. But it's her Governing the Commons is a fascinating study. It's an incredible proof or disproof rather of this market versus state dichotomy, and again pointing out based on evidence of observation. I'm just watching how are people in Sri Lanka, in Turkey, in Canada, et cetera, actually governing these resources. And so the idea of non-mechanical rules, this graduated punishment. Maybe somebody who is very poor breaks the rules, they're shoplifting because they don't have any alternative. So you can turn a blind eye, and that maintains social cohesion because there is some sense of justice that goes beyond the formal rules. And so this idea of self-organization, I think, is at the center of her work. Polycontextual management, I think, is what polyvalent management, I forget the exact term.
Polycentric governance.
Yes, so polycentric governance. This is this is where we need to be heading. And you see in the conflict in Israel and Gaza, the problem and the need for, I think exactly this is an example where Ostrom's principles can be applied in order to achieve a lasting peace. There, people need to be people have a desire to self-govern. So, and we could talk about her design principles, and I'm a big fan of that. But I could just say, you know, ditto. I don't have much to add myself.
I think a point to make is that Ostrom, what she discovered was very, very general and went beyond common pool resource groups, as we are discovering. And so what you find in any successful movement are the core design principles. Likely they never heard of Ostrom, but these are the ingredients that are needed. And so that I think that I wager that again and again, if we see what's working, we'll see that it's due in part, not entirely, but in part to the core design principles, and also polycentric governance, which is the between group component of that. And of course, pro-social world is founded upon that. Todd.
And maybe just to add one,
Yeah,
I really like yours, Paul Atkins and co.'s amendment of the principle. I think it's the second one on the clear boundaries of shifting towards a shared identity. I think this is exactly necessary to generalize this notion, because, for instance, we have a community here that we are possibly in the process of creating, and we don't have a physical boundary. We're on a Zoom session, and maybe, you know, everyone's on a screen here, but there is perhaps a sense of shared identity. Or if you're in a church group, perhaps it's the shared identity, the shared commitment to certain principles that really is creating the group cohesion. So I think that is something that you have already added.
thank you, and thank you very much, and I wholeheartedly agree. Todd.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Here, okay. Thank you, Jerome, for the talk today. I really appreciate it, and it's great to be in a room of people who kind of are recognizing the problems in our times. My name is Todd. I am a member of the Debt Collective. I have $134,000 of student loan debts that I cannot hope to repay. And I was hoping, Jerome, that you could speak a little bit more about platform cooperativism. I'm putting a link in the chat for people who are uninitiated in this type of co-op, and what you foresee as the role of the state in helping to facilitate the creation of these sorts of digital infrastructures in a country that has sold its citizens to corporate oligarchs. Thank you.
Well, I'm good friends with Trebor Scholz, who, together with Nathan Schneider, I guess, coined this term of platform cooperatives. Nathan is also co-writing a chapter in this handbook, the Routledge Handbook, that you might be interested in on online communities. And so, to me, the internet has been a big disappointment. Maybe that's the shortest way to say it. I mean, much of my self-education, we all learn things in the classroom, but I think we learn most of the things outside of the classroom in life, or we go to the library and we just pick up a book. And much of the learning that I did in rural southern Alabama, we didn't really have sidewalks. By the way, my mother would take us walking anyhow on the side of the road, and cars would pull over and ask, can we help you? Can we help you? No, my mother would say, we're just walking. We like walking. So much of the learning I did was, online. I still recall Encarta Encyclopedia. I learned a lot from there and other sources. And so I think what you've seen over the decades after the .com bubble burst is an increasing concentration of the traffic on the internet on a number of very few sites, and I don't need to name them here. And we just need to basically break those into community-based networks. And I don't think that there's any way around it. Maybe we'll need another Theodore Roosevelt, another trust buster to either break them up, or I don't think breaking them up isn't necessary, because there's a different kind of cohesion. They're global communities, they're global networks. So really they need to be accountable to the users in this case. And so the platform cooperative phenomenon, to me, is just the big question mark on the topic of the accountability that social networks and online platforms as well have to those who are producing the value, which are oftentimes workers like in TaskRabbit and these kinds of apps, the delivery apps and so on, the Ubers of the world, but also the users. So on Facebook, of course, it's the users that are creating value by posting family and baby pictures and so on. And then you see all the advertisements. And so it seems that the governance of the technology is not driven by what is in the greatest value of the community. Again, going back to this example of the community cooperative. So this, to me, the platform cooperative phenomenon in term is a very messy one. And I don't think it refers to any specific thing. It's to me always a challenge to think about an alternative vision for governing, perhaps owning online platforms, which I do think are two different things. So I don't think it's necessary to own a platform or a company even to have a stake. So in Germany, I'm half German, we have a co-determination, which of course is not utopia, but all large corporations in Germany that have more than a certain amount of workers, 500 I think it is, have to have worker representation on the board. So they don't own anything, but they are present. And again, it's not utopia, but it's already an improvement over some other model.
Yeah. Okay. Graham.
Thank you. Jerome, I've loved listening to you. Really brilliant. So I'm Graham Boyd, living in Brussels. Hope to meet up with Jerome in a few weeks' time in Brussels as well. My original career was theoretical particle physics. My second career was with Procter & Gamble in management. And since 2008, I've been dedicated to building businesses to address our global challenges like climate change, etc. One part of that, we developed an extension of the co-op called the Fair Shares Commons, which embeds all of Ostrom's principles in the incorporation as a multi-capital, multi-stakeholder commons. And I've just written a book on how to bring the insights into the non-ergodic dynamics of capital into the economy, and in particular through the necessity of profit pooling, as Mondragon does or as Lega does. The question I want to put to you, Jerome, is a question that's been driving me for a couple of decades now, which is, given that the cooperative is in so many senses manifestly better than the limited company, what is holding it back from becoming the dominant form of incorporation on the planet? What else needs to be true for Mondragon to be a small version of the cooperative at its current size versus the rest on the planet?
David Pinto is nodding his head so hard. I wonder if you want to add to that, David, before we turn back to Warren.
Okay, no, I put my hand up. I've got something to say. It just happens to be related to that point directly. We undercut the economic platform. So it's no longer based on exchange. If you have an alternative economic that is not based on exchange, and I've developed one, it means that it can support cooperative efforts. And that's, I think, the thing that's been limiting it. It's the current economic, which is based on exchange. And we haven't, to this point, got an alternative.
Yeah, and I think, David, we'll give you more space in just a minute to introduce yourself. But I mean, the most amazing thing for me about encountering your work, Jerome, is the vibrancy of these cooperative movements, because I am accustomed, brainwashed, you might say, of thinking of these as extremely fragile and hard to get started and hard to keep going. But that's what you have taught us shows differently. So it's a great question, and I think it has in part to do with the kind of the legal social environment that could either be slanted towards or against it. But back to you, Warren, Jerome, as to that this great question about that.
By the way, I see Sacagawea Hall here from Cooperation Jackson. So I be very interested to hear your experiences and reflections on whatever you've heard here, and some maybe even comments. I think we'd all be very interested. Saki, if you can hear us. But the word that I'm missing in these, I mean, it's a great question. Yes, I think it's incredibly pertinent. And there are different levels and layers and dimensions to it. And I would just bring in the word abolition and abolitionism. So it sounds to me like almost a copy of the question that people asked about why don't we end slavery, or what is the problem in ending slavery? You need a critical mass of people who are loud enough and influential enough in order to gum the gears of the system. And you had that in the 1840s and 50s, 60s with people like William Lloyd Garrison and others, Frederick Douglass, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to name all the names. Wendell Phillips. And so you're part of the question is an economic one. But it's not only an economic one, it's the economic system, as David Ellerman, my good friend, says, is intertwined with the legal system. So you're right, David, in connecting these two. And there's a great book by David, he just put it out. I mean, he's basically been saying the same thing for 50 years. So he puts out a new version of the same argument for every generation. So he's put the latest version out, I think 2 years ago. It's the book called Neo-Abolitionism, and a second book called Putting Jurisprudence Back into Economics. So he says that the idea of the invisible hand that Adam Smith is talking about is only possible with the obverse side of the legal system that says, okay, the market can operate here, it's fine. So we have a legal system that's based on property, but it doesn't ask how property is initiated, what Marx called primitive accumulation. So a lot of the wealth that people like Elon Musk, and I'm mentioning him again, have are based on, Musk's father owned 50% of an emerald mine in South Africa. So you can talk about whether the accumulated wealth that people like Jeff Bezos and all the others have are the result of hard work, or are you just lucky to have been born from the womb of somebody who, benefited from the labors of others? I think that's an important question. So, and someone's shaking their head. So I think that's something that needs to be introduced into discussions as to why cooperatives are not more common. So I think there's a great book, 1994, I think it came out by Sam Bowles, Herb Gintis, who recently passed away, and Bo Gustafsson. And I think the third chapter of the book is called Markets and Democracy. The third chapter, maybe the second chapter, asks why more democratic firms are not more readily available. And they attribute it as well to the nature of the market, which privileges certain forms of property over others. And I think a lot of it just has to do with brainwashing. In the pro-social book, you quote Gintis saying that, before the Second World War, business people were just people who started a business. And at some point, people went to business school and learned about indifference curves and utility functions and maximization and optimization. And so it has to do with, as well, with sort of, so to speak, brainwashing, I think.
Darren, if I could, let me add to that. Darren Asimoglu has a recent paper in which he compares firms that either their CEO either does or does not have an MBA. And he shows that in the firms where the CEO has an MBA, the employees get paid less, and there's no benefit for doing that. And there's almost certainly a long-term cost. It's just what they were taught.
Yes, I think that education plays a big role. So I'm in touch, for instance, with people from Mondragon. They've created the Mondragon Team Academy based on the Finnish education model there, the Falcon system, I think it's called in Finland. And they've created a bachelor's in leadership, and basically a bachelor's in business administration, leadership and innovation, it's called. And they're teaching their students that what is creating value is cooperation, teamwork. So they call themselves not entrepreneurs, but I think they're called teampreneurs. I think that's the word they use. And so I think a lot of it just has to do with exposing people. And this goes back to this non-ergodic notion that Graham talked about. I mean, economics assumes this kind of symmetry of past and present, and people are maximizing certain expected values. But in fact, there are, so to speak, sunk costs. If we do something today, we are constraining the possible actions tomorrow. So that it matters. So the information that people have today matters. And so introducing into economics books like what we're trying to do with the handbook, a more diverse and a more pluralistic pantheon of firm types. I gave a guest lecture at a Harvard Business School seminar on strategic management a few months ago, and the students, some of the students were members of cooperatives, by the way, but the professor had never heard of any of these things, had never heard of it. So if he's teaching, how to manage good companies and so on, and he's never heard of it, then of course many of the students are never going to hear about it.
Yeah. Okay. David, introduce yourself properly and add anything more that you want to. David Pinto.
Hello, thank you. My name is David Pinto. I'm co-founder of Scale. It provides an alternative economic. We treat money as a vector, not a scalar. We're not trying to simulate the current economy based on exchange, the actual operating system. We have an alternative. Okay. Now, the reason why I put up my hand, and I'm very nervous about this, is I'm not an academic. Okay, I'm a practitioner. I did social anthropology, maths. Okay, I'm interested in, thank you, I'm interested in the going to first principles, mathematics. And I was interested in going to the first principles social anthropologically. So I went to the first principles of identity and so on and so forth, but also economics. So I'm interested in collective strategy, and I'm taking this time that we are engaging, and it might be the last time, because we're talking about how do we organize ourselves, self-organize. Okay, just a couple of little references. In terms of self-organizing, I think I'm talking about cybernetics, first order, second order, third order cybernetics, multi-reflexive environments. Don't know if that triggers anything. I'm interested in Reynolds, Boyd's, organizational models. How do we transpose that to us socially? Okay. And so the conclusion that I've come up with and what I've developed is the reason why we're having difficulties, and throughout history, however amazing the results, the efforts that people are putting in, it is operating on an economic system which biases the traditional mechanics and the tendency for the system to operate the way it does, including, for example, slavery. We're never going to get rid of slavery. We have wage slavery just now. Because of money is an object, it's a scalar, it's a quantity of a thing. And we measure our time as quantity of a thing. We sell our time, or we sell bodies, okay? And unless we shift away from that fundamentally, so that money is no longer a scalar, but a vector, then we have a mechanism that deals with currency properly. We're tracking currency with a vector, which is mathematically more accurate, okay, rather than a scalar, which is our current traditional economic. So the question is, can somebody like me, who is basically a practitioner working at the soil level, at the freaking soil level, engage with you and ask you the question, are you interested in contemplating an alternative economic which contravenes everything that we currently have built on our understanding of economics? Not people's effort and actions, the psychology. There's a lot of that which we can still make use of, but would you consider, or would you be interested in, the postulate of somebody like me, nobody, turning up and saying, would a vector-based economic be a viable or interesting thing for you that deserves attention? I can't quite phrase the question well. Do you get what I'm saying in terms of a question, or do I need to frame the question a little bit better?
Warren, Jerome?
Well, I mean, part of communication is a process, but as you were speaking, I'm thinking of actually the work of Bob Ulanovitz, who has been talking about processes for many decades, and has developed, again, this process ecology approach, and looking at systems, living systems, as seeking not to be efficient and perhaps this is what you mean by the difference between scalars and scalars and vectors, but that the, for instance, the financial system today is seeking to allocate money, capital, whatever investment in an efficient way, And in fact, according to the view that Bob stipulates, his epistemological, ontological view, this is gearing us up for disaster. I mean, Bob, maybe you want to talk a little bit. I'm just sort of the messenger here. I'm carrying the water. You're on mute. Oh, no, okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I do work with networks, and networks essentially are a collection of process vectors. What I'm thinking about, however, in response to your question, is how does one vectorize an economy? Is there going to be some, central vectorization, or is it going to come about spontaneously? And I guess I'm having trouble envisioning how that would come about.
But what we want to do, and let me move on because we have a lot of other raised hands, but basically to bookmark this. And then one of the things that we try to facilitate in Pro-Social World, and other organizations might do that as well, is actually, let's just make that the center of a conversation. So I make that invitation so that we could just give that the attention that it's due, which of course is not possible in the 27 minutes we have left. So let me proceed to Peter, and then Ken, and then we have a nice long list of people here.
Well, I'm Peter Brooks. I'm more at the level in the Atlas Hugged book of John Galt as a sophomore, learning and discovering all this. I'm really a dilettante and a debutante. I had the privilege of touring Ivrea, Italy recently by a retired Olivetti engineer who was there for many years. And I learned the story of Adriano Olivetti, and I was curious if Jerome encountered that his Olivetti's visionary proposals for a large company diverting its profits into the good of society, local universities, hospitals. He was the innovator of what we call, I'm in France, it's called the Comité d'entreprise, the workers' facility. So Olivetti sponsored healthcare, children's care. He hired world-class architects to build worker housing. The factories were in the Bauhaus style. And so I was curious if you ever encountered that, because it's in the same connection as previous questions. Why hasn't Mondragon taken off? Why? And this was in 1960, Olivetti's vision. Unfortunately, he died in 63. So, I just have a question at this point, that's all.
I think, I don't know. I'm not a prophet. I think one of the most difficult tasks for social reformers or social revolutionaries, or anyone who wants to push the dial forward, is convincing people that the cost or the detriment of the current system outweighs the cost of change. There's a worker philosopher, I don't know if you're familiar with him, Erich Hofer. He was Ike Eisenhower's favorite writer. He was a longshoresman. He came from, I think, Switzerland, and worked on the docks in San Francisco. And at night, he taught some classes of adult education, and he wrote 10 books. And one of them is The True Believer. This was Eisenhower's favorite book, in fact. And he's trying to assess the rise of Nazism and totalitarianism in Europe, basically. And one of the observations he makes at the beginning of the book is people really have to feel miserable before they're willing to give up everything for a change in the system. And so even if people are homeless, I mean, I've spoken with homeless people on the street who are using cost-benefit analysis. Guy I was speaking with in Berlin a couple of years ago, homeless guy selling newspapers, said, I haven't had any losses or profits today. So what are you talking about? You're not a capitalist. So we have very much internalized this logic and cost-benefit analysis and other related types of of thinking. So much, I think, that any reform, I mean, we can go back to Robert Owen, New Lanark, New Harmony, and these communities working and living and educating together, or the kibbutzim, for instance, in Israel. I think that without some kind of, and going back to Karl Popper, perhaps piecemeal social reforms, you will never push the dial for the great collective of people beyond sort of an up and down cycle. So, I mean, there have been many social reformers who have had many great ideas. I mean, I mentioned Robert Owen as one. There are still people living in New Harmony today, about 750 people. There are many anarchist communities around, or again, I mentioned the kibbutzim. But the question, I think, is how does one spread the virus? And I think that that's just a long and tedious, Rudi Dutschke talked about the long march through the institutions. It takes not only a village, it takes many networks of villages, so to speak. But one has to see crisis also as an opportunity. And we are continually facing crisis after crisis. And so we can only all hope that as we get more social crises and more people turn not to authoritarianism, as many are doing today, but are looking at other ways to organize themselves. So like in Seattle in 1919, there was a general strike, and many people didn't even notice because everything was working as it was. People were self-organizing, there were civil services, people were offered jobs. So sometimes if the revolution has happened, maybe the best thing would be if you didn't even notice.
Yeah, so perhaps Olivetti undermined his own enterprise by treating the workers so well. I mean, many of the features of his multi-million international huge corporation, the first company to build a true Turing complete computer and the first personal computer, desktop computer, perhaps he was doing so well that there was no crisis. And so when other international companies came in and began to buy out segments of the business, then it never came to play. So I think he was doing things that would be classed under the cooperative and Ostrom style design principles before the vocabulary was in place in the 50s.
When we have more time to talk, I want to push back against some of the things you said, Jerome, because I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be a long, hard slog. And I think part of the history that you recounted of in Italy is that it can become viral. It can be like a master Tinder. I mean, it really spread, and that it depends as much on the story as on crisis. So I think that even if you're not in a crisis mode, you can still see the world in a different way that makes more sense. And after you do that, then your groups are working sufficiently well that it can proceed from there. But that's a longer conversation. I want to get to we have 4 people lined up, and Ken, after you, I'm going to jump to Kathleen, and then if you don't mind, then to Subham and Butch. So, but Ken. You might be muted.
How did that happen? I wanted to mention that there is a paradigm in which corporations are contributing to the community. It's called taxation. And in the United States, it's currently 21% federally plus state and local taxes. So corporations are paying out more than one every four of their profit dollars to local and larger community. And the other thing that I noticed, an interesting concept called polycentric governance. Polycentric governance. Would that concept argue in favor of states' rights in the United States, do you think?
Polycentric governance is part of the Ostrom legacy, not just Eleanor, but also your husband, Vincent. But Jerome, do you want to address that?
Yes, very much so. Taxation, I think, I love Noam Chomsky, by the way, who we've had a dialogue for many years. But his, you can find many YouTube videos on Noam Chomsky discussing anything. And I love his discussion of taxes. And he says, I'm just paraphrasing, we should all be very happy to pay our taxes every year because we have collectively agreed that this is what our society wants. However, of course, Chomsky is famous for paying half of his taxes throughout the 1970s because of his opposal to the Vietnam War, which my father did, I think, 4 tours in. So he was there for 2 years. Very traumatic experience for himself and others in my family and others in other families, and a great injustice. But it depends. 50% of those 20% are going to the military. And that's would be my immediate response. Your 50% of those 21%, which Trump lowered, is going to build bombs, that are being dropped somewhere in the world. So I'm being a little bit provocative in my comment. So,
but that wasn't my question, Jerome. My question was,
that's to your first point. It wasn't really a question; it was more of an observation. But your second point was a question, and to that I like the essay by Josiah Warren. Many argue the first American anarchist, who actually wrote an essay in support of the secession of southern states, saying, however, by the same principle that these states are claiming states' rights, the citizens, including the slaves of the states, can secede from these states. So I think that it would be an argument for decentralization, but that decentralization argument goes all the way down. So, of course, I mean, there was just a ruling by a federal judge in Georgia, I think today or yesterday, that suggested that the legislature did not give Black voters sufficient rights to elect a representative. So it's a question. I think polycentric also, it's a relationship. It's nested. So I think there is some kind of feed forward, so to speak, between different levels of governance and also history. So my father's from Alabama. I would not trust the political system in Alabama to be, so to speak, decentralized. It's a very authoritarian system. I've seen the jail cells of Alabama myself many times for many reasons. I can describe them to you, probably very similar to what's going on in Bolivia. So it depends, I think. It depends on the governance of those states or whatever political constructs that they exist. I mean, you have Native American tribes that have, reservations. We could consider those nations as well. By the way, the Native American lacrosse team, lacrosse is a Native American sport, it will probably not be able to play in the Olympics because they don't represent a legitimate nation. So again, this polycontextual term can be applied in many contexts. So if we consider the Native Americans to have a nation, then certainly they could play lacrosse, but that's the same logic.
But if I could just recite polycentric governance, it is this. Number 1, life consists of many spheres of activity. Number 2, each sphere has an optimal scale. Number 3, good governance requires finding the right scale for each sphere of activity and appropriately coordinating among the scales. So that means that smaller is better for some things, bigger is better than others. It does lead to a kind of federalism or subsidiarity, but in some cases, the global scale is most appropriate, and it goes above national governance. And I think it's always with the highest good in mind. And so if we get current injustices, that's no argument for or against polycentric governance, as I understand it. Kathleen, and then Subham.
Well, thank you. I want to address the question that was asked a little earlier in a general way. Why is there not more of a focus on cooperatives? I'm somebody that has spent the last 14 years living in a co-housing community, calls itself an eco-village, and I'm very familiar with the worldwide movement around the cooperative culture based on small communities that commit in one way or the other to use variations of Ostrom's principles. And I really appreciate what you're saying, Jerome, about how really people don't change until things get difficult in mental health. That's called the medical model. It's like addiction. People don't change their behavior until it gets real painful. But it's very important that people understand what are the options. And I do want to thank you for your work and your presentation, because I would say most mental health people are not aware of these cooperatives in Italy that you've described, that the use of locally based community engagement around mental health, the kind of success rate it can produce, and even how viable these cooperatives in Italy are. I do think there's a place for just talking about what's working more as a way of infecting the culture and scaling up across culture, because the average person doesn't know about these things and they really need to. They just feel hopeless. So as much as I appreciate your work, and that a lot of people on this call have a lot of different interests, and it can get quite dense and lots of sidebars off into people's different perspectives, I think there's a real place for broader, simpler messages that the average person needs to hear about. My own experience is that the college-educated people that I live with, we all are middle class, and we had to spend quite a bit of money to buy a co-housing unit. It's a condominium model. Co-housing is very expensive and not available generally to people with financial challenges. They still don't know how to be cooperative, even though they want to be. So
can I ask you where you are? Where are you located?
I'm Portland. I'm in Portland, Oregon. I'm just saying there has to be this deeper, broader message, simpler messages about what it really means to be cooperative and how that can be applied immediately within the local level, in your community, at the neighborhood level, in businesses, and at the larger level as well. These are exciting messages of hope. So let's not forget that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your enthusiasm. And I'm not sure if it can be that simple, or if it can be simplified. So I gave a lecture the day before yesterday on the concept of cooperation, where I outlined 3 different types. There's interest-based, practice-based, and principles-based, which to me, I mean, this is my spiel. So I feel they have different reasons. So one is of necessity. Usually one is actually happening through time, and you develop relations of trust, and the other has a shared sense of purpose. So very close to these core design principles. So, I mean, if we're talking about this third type with a shared purpose along, again, these polycontextual, excuse me, polycentral, it's very tired at the moment, a lot of events, but then certainly, yeah, you can boil it down to certain principles. But so I think what I was thinking about as you were speaking, I don't know if any of you know Cornelius Castoriadis, the Greek-French. He was an economist and a psychiatrist, and he worked for the OECD, and he was everywhere doing a lot of different things. And his passion was Greece. I mean, he was Greek, but the ancient Greece, the democracy in Athens. And he didn't see it as a prototype. We all need to go back to ancient Greece because, of course, they had slaves and women were not citizens and so on. So there are a lot of problems. But he saw it as a kind of seed. And what he saw in Athens, as opposed to contemporaneous societies, so you shouldn't compare Athens to something going on today in the world, but comparing Athens to Persia, for instance, he saw an instituting versus an instituted society. So people who were engaged in conversations about not only is this the right law, is this a just law, but what is justice? So the origins, he says, of politics and philosophy in the discussion of a society itself, asking itself, who are we and what is the best? And he looks at people like Herodotus, who actually is in certain senses, in other senses he's not, but in certain senses very humble, and saying, we Greeks are not very good at basket weaving, but if we go to the north, the people are much better, and maybe we can learn from them. So this spirit of instituting or inquiring as a society, it's social and collective learning is hugely important for democracy and for improving and for evolving as a society. And so maybe just to your notion about the social cooperatives, it has caught on. So the first country or polity that instituted a similar legislation to Italy after 1991 was in Canada, was Quebec in 1997. You have France, I think, in 2002. So many other countries have passed these laws enshrining these types of self-governing service provision institutions. So, and I think it's catching on, getting away from the model of clients, buying a service. It's a perverse thing. These are people who need to be incorporated into society. They're not buying a service.
Oh, so much to talk. What a feast of things to think about. Subham. And we're gonna round it out. We're gonna finish up with Margarita. And so Subham, please.
Thank you. My name is Shubham. I'm speaking from India, and it's quite late out here. Part of my work is with understanding coordination mechanisms. Part of it is with governance mechanisms. I work with movements, and I understand self-organizing systems because we are based on volunteer-driven organizations like Extinction Rebellion. I am representing a part of the world that has lived with cooperatives before the Finnish or whoever it is could claim that they were the first to do so. Because that's how we had to work with, like, because of higher concentrations of people together. I think like your classification of 3 different kinds of cooperatives really stood out. And the mention of the idea of nation states and going beyond it really stood out to me. I look at the world in 2 ways right now in terms of what could be done. With the eminent understanding that the environmental narrative is a made-up narrative so that you can sell more shit to people. One of them would be related to money, cooperatives that are related to money. And these are the cooperatives that are present in the developing world, where you're going to have a lot of different kind of enterprises in the cooperative format coming in. And the state in these authoritarian majoritarian politics would want a stakeholdership in this through their representatives controlling this vast flow or like the transactions or the like movement of goods and services that are happening. The other kind is to do with like more developed areas where you're looking at cooperatives as an immunization mechanism, where you have a banking cooperative, a water cooperative, and a market for cooperatives and different kind of infrastructural presence out there. Both of these like, are required because we are working on the concept of cooperatives, which in itself, however, is a colonial concept of institutionalization and working in a mechanism of coordination. And I've seen this because we are, as I talk about hybrid organizations, you are seeing that yesterday's NGO becomes today's cooperative because most of the stakeholders of the NGO has figured out that they have to run a business where they can sell a product or commodity, be relevant in the system. And so I feel like a movement is required to carry this narrative forward that an alternative is available and it's not communism for working together with different kinds of people. However, at the same time, that movement cannot be led by the people who stay really far away from each other, not their fault. It should be decided from a group of people who are really well groomed, because here you will have people who are part of multiple different cooperatives as a norm, but it's not really happening. Their people are still segregated in silo. I'll rest there. Thank you for the talk. Check.
Thank you. I think I heard most of what you said. And just on the topic that you mentioned of the colonial legacy of cooperative movements in the world, including in India, there's a wonderful book by Rita Rhodes, a friend of mine, who wrote the book. It's called Cooperation and Empire, or Empire and Cooperation, rather, how the British Empire used cooperative in its development strategies. That might be very of interest to you. And there certainly is some validity and relevance to this aspect, especially what you were saying, of the origins of cooperation as a formal concept versus the cooperation that you see happening sporadically, that, for instance, people like Pyotr Kropotkin in Russia and Siberia cataloged, or many others in other places through ethnography and anthropological studies, or just it's ongoing and just not even observed. And so that there needs to be, especially within the cooperative movement, I think, a self-examination of maybe some of these elements of coloniality. You have similar phenomena in the former Soviet Union, where there were very strong centralistic tendencies within the cooperatives that existed there, which has left a lingering bitter taste, so to speak, aftertaste, when people in the former Soviet Union hear about cooperatives. Oh, no. And so there is some work there to be done there in that regard. Yeah, so thank you for the comment. Much to say. Yeah. I could say much else there.
Yeah, no, this whole conversation has been amazingly informative. So Butch, and then Margarita.
Hi, folks. I'm Butch Bosson. I'm a retired federal employee and also a consultant with different federal agencies. But for the past 2 years, I've been a member of a group called the Forum on Democracy. And I'm going to give a shameless promotion here because this December 1st, we're having a conference on democracy. It'll be in Washington, D.C. For those of you who want to join online, we can send you a link if you give me your email, but we're dealing with a lot of the topics that we've been discussing here today. And I think, Jerome, you're going to be on that agenda, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yes.
Yes, yeah. So we've been dealing a lot with governance, not government, but governance in the sense that governance is citizen-centric. And democracy is a complex adaptive system rather than a reductionist top-down approach. I wanted to mention briefly Jeremy Rifkin's recent book on the age of resilience, because I think he captures a lot of what we've been talking about. And one reason why cooperatives are not expanding at the rate that we think that they should be. Rifkin talks about two paradigms. One paradigm is the paradigm of efficiency, and it's based on a reductionist approach to extracting everything we can from this planet. And it's focused on things, analytics, predictive capability, etc. He says that paradigm, which is currently dominant and supported by economic, cultural, and political forces, are going to be very hard to displace with the paradigm that he's in favor of, which is a paradigm of resilience. And resilience is based on relationships, process, rather than objects. And until the dominant paradigm of efficiency is somehow displaced, it's going to be a very difficult one. You're going to have a lot of examples of decentralized self-governance. There are many, many books written about such things as citizens' assemblies. He can cite examples, as many other authors can, of these cooperative self-governance approaches springing up like zoysia grass, but they're not going to be able to scale up as long as the dominant paradigm is one of efficiency. And efficiency is based on continuing to extract resources from this planet until we're facing existential threats. The problem is that the efficiency paradigm is propped up by everything in our society right now. It's just the dominant paradigm. And until we can figure out a way to deconstruct the narratives of people who live by this paradigm, we're going to have a difficult time expanding the paradigm of resilience, of which these cooperatives are a major part. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that comment. Maybe just to plug maybe two other books. I think, again, Bob Ulanovitz is here. You were nodding as well. I think Bob's work is also fascinating for anybody interested in exactly this distinction between efficiency and the resilient paradigm. I would recommend his book, I think 2009, The Third Window. Wonderful book on actually moving from Newtonian mechanics through Darwin to a process-based view. Probably, who knows, maybe Rifkin cites it. And then, of course, the recent book, not getting less recent, by David Graeber and David Wengrow, Dawn of Everything. Many of you have probably heard the bestseller. Also a very interesting book from an anthropological and archaeological perspective. Very similar arguments.
Yeah, and I'd like to put in a vote for a paradigm change. It's something that we're working very hard at, and I'm actually optimistic that this is something that could actually, despite the past, the resilience entrenchment basically of the neoclassical paradigm in the past, that it will be possible to work a tipping point, and I think more on that. Stay tuned for that in the very near future. So Margarita, you get the final word.
All right, David. There is a little problem with my camera. let me segue on what you said about a paradigm shift. Yes, we're in the middle of a paradigm shift, and it may not be as difficult as it may look from being in the middle of it, so to say. The comments that I have, I would call them, or at least I hope they are perceived as complementary and affirmative, and totally in the spirit of the pro-social world initiative. This is an initiative to bring something in the classroom that needs to be there much more. And I personally, but let me first introduce myself before I do that. I don't know whether David remembers, but we met in the early 2000s at Binghamton University. Dus my name is, do you remember me? My name is Margaretha Hendricks. I was a professor.
Of course I do, Margaret, I do.
All
And
right.
Margaretha and I lived together. We were roommates in Binghamton, by the way, many years ago.
Yeah. So that's the way we all connect. And so there, dus I had dus applied your thinking, so to say, to the school, or thinking about how managers teach or talk with each other, and how management professors do research and teach management. And that sort of thinking brought me in touch with Karl Popper, who has a theory of evolution, or it's not maybe a theory, maybe one can call it a theory, but he really focuses on the role of language, and he kind of boils it down to thinking logically. And I think that is the spirit in which you, David, are moving. Dus to kind of slowly really put our finger on how are we using language, because, and that gets back to what Kathleen said, dus we have this word mental illness or whatever, but what does that even mean, a mental illness? So if we can get to little children very early on and help them understand how language works, how we introduce difference, how it helps think creatively, then we actually get in touch with something that can accelerate just the cooperative movement, so that some of our problems are that we literally have cut off our own knees. And it's not that I do it or you do it, but as a society we do it by not thinking about certain distinctions and the degree to which they are productive. And so to connect back to Jerome, this is an ongoing conversation between me and Jerome, and I hope David to become more active in this initiative at some point.
Jerome, first you, and then I'll do a wrap up.
A good friend of mine is a professor of economics at a private university in the south of Germany. His name is Josef Wieland. He wrote a book called The Relational Economics, a Political Economy. And during our first phone conversation, we've had very many conversations and conferences and so on since then, he compared economists to mechanics or technicians or people who have practice a craft. So they're not scientists in his point of view or philosophers who are thinking, but they have a certain toolbox and they apply the toolbox to whatever problems they come across. So I think, moving to what Margaretha said, a focus on the role of language in seeing and perceiving the world and interpreting the world, and in perhaps therefore affecting the world, is absolutely central to getting out of the morass that we are in the world. You know, whether we're talking about us and them thinking, or basically people embedding themselves in a certain class or other ethnic or other roles or functions, a focus on the language that we use is absolutely central. It's and we should be very critical about and self-critical about the assumptions that we make, even using everyday language. So that's all I would say. Yeah, so I agree.
Yeah, and I think that's really highlighted by cultural evolutionary theory, and in particular dual inheritance theory, which notes that there's two streams of inheritance in our species. In the cultural stream, is basically symbolic thought. Our worldviews, our meaning systems, the way we think and feel are the cultural equivalent of our genes. And we've even coined the word symbotype to stress the comparison. And so everybody's symbotype, everybody's worldview results in a repertoire of behavior, which is good. They provide some flexibility. But if you're going to go beyond that, you must change what's on the inside before you can change what takes place, the actions that take place on the outside. And so inner change in combination with outer change, and to be mindful about the whole thing, is basically what's needed, and what Pro-Social World is attempting to do, along with many others. So I want to end, first of all, by thanking everyone. Jerome, you first and foremost. What an amazing person you are, in so many ways. And so there's so many great people and organizations here. Pro-Social World is proud to be a convening organization, but also proud to work collaboratively with many other organizations and to recognize all the great things that they're doing. So if we want to continue, then if to get in touch with us, hello@prosocial.world. We'll get you a real human, and we can continue this conversation. So with that, final thanks, and we'll see you down the road. Thank you very much.
And thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.